Hello and welcome back to another PoreLab lecture series. Our today's speaker is Dr. Timo Koch, postdoctoral researcher at the University of Oslo. He studied environmental engineering and did a PhD at the University of Stuttgart on mixed dimension methods to model flow in porous media with embedded network structures and applied these methods for root soil interaction flow in vascularized biological tissues and well models for hydrological reservoirs. He is one of the main developers of the open source porous media simulator DUMUX. Today he is going to talk about mixed dimension models for flow and transport processes in porous media with embedded tubular network systems. Thank you, Timo, for accepting our invitation.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. So as Mohammed mentioned, the topic of my PhD is actually going to be the topic of the talk today as well. I continue working on these kind of methods now. So I was in Stuttgart before working with Rainer Helmig, and now I'm at the University of Oslo working with Kent Andre Marda on flow in the brain in the broad sense. We're gonna go through all the words at some point that are in the title, so I'm not gonna bother you that much with it. But as an introduction, we're gonna look at porous media, and this is just an example of a porous medium, and there are many different kinds. But there are some common properties. So usually we have a high surface area, and we can use that in a couple of applications. We also might have a good storage capacity in our porous medium. There might be stuff in there that we want to get out. But if it comes to transport, this small pore structure makes transport quite difficult. So we have low permeability structures and therefore low transport of substances through a porous medium. So some systems, some biological systems and some people in technical applications came up with a very simple idea. So this is nothing new. We can embed networks into the structure that allow for fast transport. And then if we make sure that there's also transport from the network to the rest of the porous medium, we can actually manage to transport substances efficiently from further away points to everywhere in the porous medium. So where does this occur? It's a couple of applications, and I'm just going to go through some. There's vascularized biological tissue. Everyone has it on themselves, and basically every bit of the human body is filled with capillaries at the smallest level, and blood vessels at a bigger level. So if you zoom in and you have the brain as an example on the left, which is a biological soft tissue with a vascular structure, and you look at some piece on the cortex, you look inside and you're going to see a structure like this. So what you see here is this is essentially the surface of the brain. And then these big vessels are not shown in the picture on the left. They would actually go in mostly in these folds, and they're covering the brain. And then there's functional tissue in here which we want to supply with oxygen, with fluids, with nutrients. But the structure of the tissue consists of cells, and it's a porous medium with a very low permeability. So we need some efficient transport system. And so there are these smaller so-called penetrating vessels that go down here. And then from these vessels, you have even smaller vessels that spread here everywhere and fill up the space and supply nutrients and oxygen to the entire system. And then you can see this, of course, as a network. If you zoom in on the lowest level, you're maybe gonna even see some red blood cells in the blood here. This is shown on this simulation. And obviously, it is not enough for some applications to describe the flow in the network, but we actually, to make sense of the function, we actually are interested in the exchange of the network with the surrounding tissue. This is what we're going to look at today. Another interesting application that goes in the same direction is root water uptake. Roots form networks in the soil. Soil has a porous medium, low permeability, and it has water and nutrients in there, and the root wants to get it out efficiently. So it also forms, the plant forms a network into the porous medium. If you look at a root cross section, it might look something like this down here. In the middle, you have this bundle of tubes apparatus, which is called xylem, and it's a fast transport mechanism in axial direction along the root. And then you also have some possibility to get water from the soil into this xylem. So you again have a tubular structure inside the porous medium. The same occurs in technical applications. So if we go to subsurface application where we drill holes, and people have gotten quite good at that. So what we see here is actually maybe simple wells. So although it's actually quite hard to do this kind of thing when you drill a hole, but people have managed to do all kinds of like these network-like structures, even to get oil, for example, out of a low permeable reservoir. And we have the same structure again, tubular structures inside a porous medium to enhance transport. This is what I'm going to talk about today, but just as also to put it in another picture, there's also other embedded networks that are non-tubular, obviously. So we also have these sheet-like networks, for example, in fractured rocks. But also, if you look at biological tissues between the cells, this looks like sheets. And people have developing numerical methods to look at mass flow, temperature, energy flow inside these systems. And there's also, if you start from the tubular domain and you actually look at some network which is closer to the pore scale, so you go all the way down, then there's these pore network type of models where you look at the actual pore space as a network. And what you can do is you can actually also look at the surrounding solid on that scale as a network, because it's basically on the same scale. So yeah, especially if you look at materials that have porosities of, I don't know, 50%. You're gonna have very similar structures in the solid and the fluid. From a modeling point of view, you can both view them as interconnected networks. But we're going to talk mainly about this application today. And what they all have in common is that mass and energy transport at these internal interfaces, so and from the sheets to the surrounding matrix, or at these interfaces of the tubes, or between solid and pore in these other networks, is essential to describe the processes that we want to look at. And we have to do this accurately. So this is not a very simple task. So because I like doing this alongside applications, I'm gonna just tell you how I think about the mathematical model for flow in such a system at the example of the tissue perfusion example. So we're gonna talk about how to reduce the model so we don't have to do a full 3D simulation of the entire space. We're going to arrive at mixed dimensional PDEs, and we'll discuss a bit what the numerical techniques are then to solve this. So we look at the brain at a tiny the tiny portion of the gray matter here. And we have this network embedded there. If you zoom a bit closer, you see the vessel structure and the in-between part, we just call it extravascular space for now. And we perform this abstraction and say, okay, these vessels are very interesting features and they form hierarchical networks. So we were gonna look at them separately, and then the rest that remains is gonna be cells, fibers, and there's interstitial fluid flowing between the cells and the fibers, shown in blue here. And we separate these two conceptually. And then we look at the network and we see that these vessels are actually very thin in comparison to our domain size and in comparison to the distance between vessels. And that leads to another decomposition where we say, well, if we just regard the whole volume as a tissue, and take out the vasculature completely, we actually don't make that big of a volume error. So these vessels only have about 2% of the volume. So we don't actually make that big of an error. So we can separate these systems and then say they communicate via mass and energy transport. Just for this extravascular space, how this roughly looks like. So this is reconstructed cell surface from the neuropil in the brain, and you can see in different colors different types of cells. They're quite small, and the space in between them is even smaller. The space in between is marked in black in these images down here. So this is only a couple of nanometers thick, these interstitial spaces. And then in comparison, our vessels are a few micrometers in diameter. So they're going to be quite big structures in comparison to the surrounding tissue. So what we do is another simplification. We say we can homogenize the rest of the tissue. So we use standard Darcy scale approaches for the rest, and we take out the vasculature. And then for the vascular itself, we can also greatly simplify, so we don't have to do full 3D simulations, at least not in a first approximation. So we can simplify them as round tubes. And we can actually integrate over cross sections and then form one-dimensional models posed on the center line. So we're only going to look at it in terms of these integral pressures inside the vessels. Then we'll arrive at this the basic system for describing flow in these tubular systems and the surrounding porous medium. And you have here some Poiseuille type equation. You have Darcy flow in the porous medium in the 3D domain. So 3D here, 1D here. And you have a coupling term. And this is now a source term for both domains. What goes in the one domain goes out of the other domain. The driving force is a pressure difference between the network and the surrounding space. So now our problem is that we wrote down one-dimensional equations for these network structures. They're for one segment, and then they're coupled by enforcing pressure continuity at the junction nodes. And we have these pressures now only at the center line, or we assume that we have some average pressure in the vessel. But now in the mathematical sense, this is going to be a 1D entity embedded in a 3D space, and we can't directly couple them. We need to somehow jump these two dimensions that are now mismatching between these two models. And what we do is formally we introduce this kernel function, which distributes the mass that comes from the vessel and distributes it in a 3D volume in porous matrix surrounding the vessels. We're going to talk about this kernel, and we're going to talk about how to actually compute numerically now, or how to approximate this exchange flux between the two systems. We introduced this kernel, and the main important property of this kernel is if we do an integral over our entire domain, and we integrate all of our source terms, then this has to equal the integral over the source terms that we find when we only look at the line. So this makes sure that what ends up in the 3D is actually what leaves the 1D, and the other way around. So we have mass conservation. And there's now a family of these 1D, 3D schemes, and they come from different choices of this kernel. And depending on the kernel, you might also use some kind of reconstruction to compute this source term. And the source term depends on the pressure difference, and we still have to define how to compute this pressure difference. So when you look at the actual 3D system, you would have your tube, and you want to have the exchange here on the interface. And there's actually, for the vessel case, there's now a thin membrane. And you would have an inner pressure, and you would have an outer pressure right on the surface. You would have some permeability of this membrane, which gives you a pressure jump, and this pressure jump can be correlated with some effective permeability to the exchange flux. But now, when we're looking at this in this abstract way, we only have this average pressure in the middle, and we might have for some given discretization of the outside space, let's say it's like this, we might only have like some pressure information somewhere in the vicinity. Now we're going to look at different ways to approximate this flux between the tubes and the porous matrix. And I'm going to present 3 different approaches. They're going to differ by the source distribution and by the reconstruction. So for this, we look at a simplified problem. So we're going to have a long straight vessel in an infinite domain. The vessel has a small radius and thus small volume, so we can do this decomposition. They're coupled with the source term. And then for this problem and for the equation I showed before, there's actually then an analytical solution. So it's this logarithmic type of pressure distribution. And you're going to have some interface pressure here at the outer boundary of the this plot is a plot through this axis. You're going to have some pressure on the surface of the vessel. This is this pressure, and you're going to have an average pressure in the lumen of the vessel, and there's a jump between, which is due to this membrane in between. And then you can formulate your source term like this. Then what Carlo D'Angelo came up with, or he looked at this type of problem in his PhD thesis. He said, well, let's put the source actually on the center line. So formally, we're going to have this delta distribution that puts all of the mass right onto the center line. And then what this is going to give us is our analytical solution for this problem would be would go to infinity here. So we have a singularity right at the center line. But then he says, in order to construct this source term, I'm actually not going to evaluate on the center line now, because there my solution is not defined. But I do an average of the 3D pressure on the actual surface. And then for this simple problem, it's the case that you get exactly this value on the surface if you do the average on the surface. If you compute the flux like this, the analytical solution is going to look like the blue line, and actually outside the vessel, you're going to recover the exact actual analytical solution. So this comes with some numerical problems, because you introduce this singularity, and in order to get this average right, you actually need to resolve your 3D mesh around this singularity. And then you get suboptimal convergence rates because you have a singularity in your solution. It's not regular enough. So another solution that Tobias Köppel, Paulo Zunino, and others came up with is they say, now we do this a bit closer to the reality. Although our vessel is cut out, we actually distribute our source on the surface of the vessel at every point. So over the surface of the cylinder. And then we still do the same kind of average operator to estimate the 3D pressure in our exchange flux. And then you get, for the simple problem, an analytical solution like this, where you have this kink here in the pressure solution. And I mean, it doesn't go to infinity anymore, so that's nice, and you actually get some better numerical properties from this. But there's still this kink, and there's still the problem that in order to actually resolve your average, you need to go quite fine with the grid. So what these people have to do in their works is they actually, for the 3D domain, they have to choose a discretization length which is kind of around the radius of the vessel or a bit smaller. So this leaves you with a lot of elements in the 3D domain. So we thought about how we can tackle this problem, and then we came up. We thought we can regularize the solution. So instead of using distributing your source on the line or on the surface, we actually distribute it now in some region that is larger than the vessel. So in some volume we distribute it. It shouldn't be too big, obviously, because then we're making a big error. But it shouldn't be too small also, because then we recover the same solution as before. So if we do this now, we get this regularized pressure solution. And now our problem is that is nice for numerics. So now we can solve this pressure solution. But the problem is this is actually not the real pressure. So what we need to recover is this pressure up here. It's the pressure on the surface, and we don't have it anymore in the numerics now. But luckily for this linear problem, we can actually use this analytical solution locally to reconstruct this surface pressure from the regularized pressure that we have down here. So we can change this in terms of this regularized pressure times some factor that's gonna provide the proper scaling. And yeah, this factor turns out to be like this, and you can show that for the parameters that we are looking at in these kind of applications. This is always well defined if you choose a large enough kernel of like 2 times the radius, for example. So this was very nice, and we compared these 3 schemes now in convergence studies, so against the analytical solution. So I have to mention that the 3D solution, so if you go back, the blue thing is basically the pressure solution in the 3D space. And this is actually going to be different for all these methods. So in this convergence plots, we cannot really compare the errors on this plot, but the solution inside the vessel. So we're looking here at the problem of some cube, and there's a horizontal there's a vertical vessel. The analytical solution has some pressure gradient over this vessel, and it's kind of this logarithmic thing in the 3D. So the solution in the 1D domain and the exchange flux, they have to be the same for all the methods. and they have to be the same as if we would resolve the interface with a 3D mesh. And then we can actually see that when we apply this regularization plus the reconstruction, we actually get the lowest errors, and we also get optimal convergence rates. So this is here for a finite volume scheme where we expect order 2 convergence, and we also get this for both the flux and the pressure in the 1D space. And this also leads then to better convergence rates of the pressure in the 3D space. So while these other methods here have this suboptimal convergence, we recover the optimal rate. So what about networks? We look now at one single vessel. And there's several cases in networks which are a bit different, but we showed that they for this application they're not really important. So we're gonna distribute our mass in some vicinity around this network that is shown here, for example. But then we have a problem at these points like here, where there's a kink, and at these bifurcation points, because there our zones where we distribute the mass will overlap, and then our reconstruction is not exact anymore. But we compared different schemes, and we refined the grid in all of them. So we didn't have an analytical solution in this case, but used very fine grids, and we can see that all the methods basically came out at the same exchange flux between the total exchange flux in this case between the network and the porous medium. But then what we notice is if we choose this kernel about 3 times the radius, for example, we can already, for a very low resolution of the 3D mesh, we can already get a very good estimate of this flux. While for some other methods, we actually get very poor estimates here with a deviation of about 50%. For these coarser meshes, and then later we can also recover the same flux. And later means we are here already resolving the structure of the vessel with the 3D grid. So this is actually not what we expect to obtain an efficient simulation. We don't want to go this fine. So this was looked very promising, and we applied these kind of schemes to simulate, for example, now contrast agent transport in this bit of a bigger network. So this is going to be this is 2 millimeter by 1 millimeter here. This piece that I cut out, and this is a measured network of a rat brain. And then you use a 3D structured grid in the background, which is quite fine. This is why it's not shown. But in this a bit academic example, I admit, we made the vessels leaky in this internal region of the network, and then you can see that this contrast agent, which is shown in black in the vessels, it's actually leaking out here, and forms this kind of red ball evolving there. And contrast agent leakage in the brain is very important to analyze MRI images, for example, in tumors. So we're using this in this kind of application now in my new position in Oslo. What I use to do the simulations is a software called Dumux, and Mohammed mentioned this. I'm one of the core developers. So I wanna quickly show you something about Dumux also now. It's an open source software written in C++ for flow and transport processes in porous media, for modeling flow and transport process in porous media. It's based on Dune. Dune is a generic framework, a generic numerics environment for solving PDEs. And it's kind of a toolbox, very modular, and Dumux builds on these tools. For example, it uses the linear solvers, it uses the grid structure of Dune. And it implements on top some finite volume discretization schemes and some multi-phase, multi-component transport models in porous media. So we have a lot of different models already implemented, so you don't need to, it's not a PDE framework in which you come with your own equation. You can do that, but there's also a lot of models already there. So one-phase flow in porous media, two-phase, three-phase, and then different multi-component models that use constraint solvers to determine the phase state. Richard's model I'm going to talk about in a minute to, for example, simulate processes in the soil. And then there's different types of fluids in there with their thermodynamical properties implemented. And you can do different types of fluid configuration depending on how you want to simplify your system: miscible, immiscible, compressible, incompressible, using an energy balance or not solving an energy balance, having equilibrium between solid and fluid or not. These are different types of models that are all available in Dumux already, so you don't need to implement them. And we basically solve all of them in this generic form. So we have some kind of storage term, we have some kind of flux term, and we have some kind of source term. I'm not going to go into details of this, like a bit generic multi-phase model that considers advection and diffusion. So this is the flow in porous medium. And as I said, there's some solvers in there. You could also put in your own solvers for simplifying aspects of your state of the fluid and solid phases. And there's different effects included, including evaporation, condensation. You can simulate dissolution processes if the solid matrix in the porous medium dissolves into the fluid. And you can consider multiple fluid phases in the pore space. There's the constitutive relations already implemented, and it's implemented in a way that you can put in your own relationships if you have better ones. And in addition to this porous medium models, there's now also a variety of other models which can be also then coupled to these porous medium models, which allows for different interesting applications. So we now have also free flow models solving Navier-Stokes equations and some turbulence models. There's a shallow water model. And you could, for example, now simulate the mass and energy transport on the interface of a porous medium with the atmosphere, for example, if you do soil atmosphere studies. There's going to be pore network models in a future version. This is already quite of an older concept, but hasn't made it into the release yet. And there's mechanical there's mechanics solvers that solve in a coupled way also the mechanical deformation of the solid matrix of a porous medium. So we can couple all of these individual models together in a framework which we called multi-domain. And I'm gonna show different applications of this. So one of them is the one that we already saw on the right. So we're gonna have a one-dimensional network and a three-dimensional space surrounding it. And then you could solve some equations on each of these grids on these systems separately. And then what Dumux gives you is the necessary tools to now find, for example, for this segment here, which 3D elements do I intersect with? Or maybe if I have this kernel method and I want to distribute it in a region, it's some more cells, so it helps you doing that. And then it also allows you to assemble the full coupled Jacobian matrix for this coupled system. in this block kind of structure. So you would assemble your system for the individual domains on the diagonal. And then on each of these off-diagonal plots, you actually have the terms related to couplings between these domains. You could think of other type of couplings. So you could be on the same grid, but you maybe use a different discretization scheme, or you use two different equations that you just want to couple together in that loose way. You can have, you can have non-matching grids that you want to couple together. You can have different types of meshes, like a structured mesh and an unstructured mesh, and they may be overlapping. And then you need to also compute these intersecting elements, and the software helps you do that. And you don't have to implement it yourself. So I use this software. You can check it out at dumux.org. And a second application now that I wanted to show that I also do in Dumux is simulating soil root flow. And the motivation here is that you want to understand how plants take up water from the soil. And there are experiments where they use some type of tracer that is going to be placed in the fluid surrounding the root. And then they look at where does the tracer end up. Maybe they use a tracer that doesn't enter the root, so it will accumulate at the root surface, or they use a tracer that goes inside the root, but maybe not at the same rate as water does. So this might be the case, for example, for this deuterium here. So you have some heavy water. And then you need to interpret these images, and you need to see what does it mean for the water uptake. And this is where simulations come in handy. What we do here is we solve soil flow using Richard's equation, and then we do one bundle of tubes model in the 1D domain. We use the coupling concept described before. And then we can actually simulate how a tracer that is initially somewhere in the bottom of the domain now gets taken up by the root. The driving force here is some transpiration at the leaves of the root that will create a pressure gradient and will suck out the water on the top. And this leads to the root actually taking up this water here. We looked at this simulation for a while, and we realized that actually for these type of root systems, you have another aspect. You have that the relative permeability of your porous medium now depends non-linearly on the saturation. And when you go to very dry soils, then this is actually gonna be very difficult for your 1D, 3D scheme, because these gradients that we saw before at the vessel, when they now have this logarithmic shape here, they get even larger due to this non-linearity, and it becomes very difficult to resolve this. So in a current project, we're actually looking at two different things. So you can use local refinement in your grid to actually resolve the interface better, but that results in more complicated grids and also in more computational power that you need. And we're also looking at generalizing this reconstruction scheme for this nonlinear equation, and that also seems to work out. So we can actually here have a better reconstruction than we did before, only for the linear case. So this was already it from my side. If you have any questions, I'm here. And you can also reach me after the talk under this email address. You can check out Dumux here. Yeah, happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Timo. Is there any question from the participants?
Hello, this is Björn Hafschall. I have a question to your equations on the flow between the vessel and the porous medium.
Yeah.
I saw you use the pressure difference as the driving force.
Yeah.
If you have fluids that are mixtures, different components, then I guess you should use the full chemical potential, including the composition difference also in that equation.
Yeah, so I assume, of course, that that the pressure difference is now here enough to describe it. It's a simplified system. What I also had in the equation is an osmotic pressure difference, because you have some solutes that you have inside the blood, but they don't exist outside the blood because they can't cross the barrier. So you have an additional osmotic gradient, and this actually has been quantified. And it seems that for the vessel, this osmotic gradient is basically constant. So it's kept up at some constant difference. So the blood flow by putting in new molecules. That's basically a molecule called albumin that's driving this osmotic difference. So this is basically constant, and I haven't included any variations in that in my model, because it hasn't been important for the type of applications I've been looking at so far. So also when I look, for example, at contrast agent transport, this is like some metal small nanomolecule, and it's assumed that this doesn't have any interaction with the rest of the fluid, and then I use a model and transport it by diffusion and advection with the rest of the phase, and then the driving force will then be the concentration difference, and I haven't generalized this to chemical potentials yet, and I don't know if it's necessary for the application. It could be so, but I haven't done it.
Okay, thank you. May I have another comment, please?
Yeah.
There is another area where I think this technique would be very useful, and that is in fuel cells.
Yeah.
You may have looked at that already.
Uh,
Distribution of fuel coming in through tubes and into the electrodes material, which is a porous medium.
Yeah, so in Stuttgart, we have looked at fuel cells, but in a different context, because for fuel cells, it's actually quite important how the local distribution of the water is, and you could resolve the channels as tubes, but this really doesn't give you the detail that you need to resolve the water distribution in these thin diffusion layers of the fuel cells. So it's quite important where the water is located and how it's transported exactly into the gas stream. So I guess these models could be used there, but only on a very coarse kind of level.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other question? Okay, thank you so much, Timo. It was an excellent presentation.
Thank you. So yeah, if you have any follow-up questions, just write me an email.
Of course.
Yeah.
And, have a nice day.
You too. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.